Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books, and I'm very glad to be joined today by a new Orbis author, Father Dustin Feddon, who is the author of this fantastic book, More Than Halfway Home, A Story of Accompaniment in the Shadows of Incarceration. Father Dustin is a Catholic priest of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee and founder of Joseph House, a home and community for men released from prison. And I want to say at the start that I can hardly express how moved I was by this book, which is about many things: prison chaplaincy, the brokenness and brutality of our system of mass incarceration, and one man's efforts to create a different kind of space that welcomes people back into the human family. But it is really so much more. It's a sustained meditation on the meaning of life, on the possibilities of grace and transcendence, the mystery of goodness and what it takes to bring that to the surface, and on the weight and the hard work of resurrection. It speaks to the wider human condition, not just for those entangled with the criminal justice system, but really universal themes. And on top of that, I have to say it is just so beautifully written with passages that really sing and take your breath away. It's a book that I wish everyone could read. So that's a lot to live up to, but welcome, Father Justin.
Well, thank you, Robert. Wow, and thank you for those words. I, when I hear things like that, I'm still thinking, well, wait, who's the author that you're thinking of? But yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, and as I mentioned to you already before, thrilled to have this work find its home at Orbis.
Well, the book begins as you're embarking on your vocation as a somewhat delayed vocation as a priest, and you're feeling that you want something or you're called to something a little different than conventional parish ministry, and you find your way to prison ministry, which leads you on a path that you did not expect, and causes you to just transform your whole understanding of what your vocation is. So, what drew you to that, and what how did it affect you in the short term and in the long term?
Yeah, I think, Robert, it was more born out of a great existential kind of frustration that here I am in my early 30s, and I've left a PhD program to enter into seminary to become a Catholic priest, and now 2 years into seminary, and I'm I have no uh, um, clear sense that this is the vocation that that I feel called to, and there was a lot of questioning and kind of like a midlife crisis. I mean, just in terms of what am I doing here? How did I get here? And so it was more initially what I was kind of what I knew that I didn't want to continue to do, which was feel like I'm boxed into a certain kind of manufactured parish experience and what the parish priest life looks like. And I had this pastoral year, a year of an apprenticeship. And to me, that was kind of like the one opportunity to kind of get out a little bit more and to explore the type of ministry that had drawn me initially, frankly, even into the church, reading about Dorothy Day and the Catholic workers, reading about the life of Simone Weil and her constantly kind of trying, and experience, new experiences of the possibility of God and of social justice in this world. And so I kind of, in a way, I had this dream of these models for me, and somehow, not really by my kind of at least initial plan, I was given the opportunity and encouraged to check out prison ministry if I wanted to get outside of parish ministry in a way, or do something more than just the standard parish ministry to try out prisons. And it was, as I detail in the book, it was that first night on death row and hearing the stories of these men and seeing the conditions in which they were in and the realities of life that they face every single day with the very likely certainty of execution awaiting them, that my world just flipped upside down. And it, to
Mm.
me, it was something that I was felt like I was kind of something was happening to me rather than me kind of planning something or trying to make something work.
Well, many of the men you meet, some of them are on death row. You describe accompanying, in a couple of cases, men to their execution. Others are serving massively long sentences, 20, 30 years, life sentences. And these are people that are commonly called, the worst of the worst.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you seem to discover quite early on, that kind of categorization of people as somehow completely other, not human, not like us in any way, is wrong and just very simplistic. And you are able to penetrate that, or at least that reality penetrates you in a very deep way that affects your understanding of your vocation.
That's right. I think it was, I mean, prisons were never on my radar. I was a doctoral student in religion and philosophy. If I were to say in those first couple of years of seminary life what my future would look like, it was something of a mix between parish life and academic life in some form. And yet that night, talking to Tavares on the G Wing at death row, um, I it was as though the universe just began to expand and something was emerging in front of me that I had not experienced before in any way, shape, or form. And it was Tavares and many other men uh, giving me a little bit of a window into their world, into this kind of prison world that it was hard to believe, Robert, that I've driven past these exits to these massive prisons countless times on I-10 or
Yeah.
I-95 in Florida, and just a couple of miles past the interstate are these incredibly dehumanizing spaces where thousands of men are chained and confined in miserable conditions. And it was, I mean, I try not to overuse this word. It can maybe at times, if we're not careful, become a cliche, but the best word I can describe is an awakening to
Mm.
a reality that I had not encountered before that night going on to death row.
Well, of course, many of these men have actually committed, horrible crimes, and you don't minimize that. You describe what they're there for, and they don't minimize it either. Although they, in many cases, it was one moment out of a life, a hard life of suffering and poverty, trauma, in many cases, intergenerational trauma, fueled by psychosis or rage or inebriation or whatever. Uh, and but our response to that is basically to just lock people up in a cage, throw away the key, and if they ever do get out, we've done nothing whatsoever to kind of. And we talk about rehabilitation, which is usually just, are you going to commit another crime or something like that? But you're talking about something deeper than that, and kind of reawakening the capacity for someone to realize their dignity and their status as human beings, which is more of a kind of redemption, resurrection,
Mhm.
which the prison system is just not equipped for and not designed to achieve.
No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think you describe it really well, which is that, on one hand, it was an extraordinary kind of awakening that night on death row, but it was also very telling just how ordinary
Hmm.
in some ways these men were in the conversations that we had, and realizing that, we're many of them are 15, 20, 25, 30 years into their sentence. So 30 years or so, 20 years or so removed from that fateful night, that the vast majority of them, as you described perfectly, a kind of a cocktail of psychosis and drugs, that oftentimes, not to mention layers of trauma, that they made an incredibly horrific decision to take the life of another person or persons.
Hmm.
Um, but in real time, you and with them, and when you're face to face with these men, I I I don't know what other people experience. I can only say what I've experienced, and that is that the presence of God, to me, it was as real, in some ways, maybe even more real. The reality of redemption bore down on me than it has in sanctuaries or seminaries.
Yeah, you say a lot of it is about the lessons that you've learned, not just what you have shared with them, but how it affects you, how it changes you. And you say at one point, they taught me about goodness in the world, which is something that comes as a surprise to people, about how porous reality is between us and the slow and meandering work of redemption. I'm particularly interested in that phrase, the porous reality between us. What does that mean for you?
I think how the porous reality for me between us, is how, in hearing their stories, though they grew up, the vast majority of these men, in real life ghettos and hardcore street life, um, that I was also hearing kind of my own failings and my own dreams.
Hmm.
Um, the the shared sense of our interconnected lives, is something that I repeatedly experience and have experienced, since meeting with those men on that night, and multiple other times. So much so that one of the things that lead me to trying to form a community is a real community, of a real sense of kinship, of connection, because to me that porous reality is a universal truth of
Hmm.
the world that we have been created and brought into.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, it wasn't manifest in necessarily a physics lab, but it was manifest in close proximity, up close and personal in these prison cells. It's just something about hearing the echoes of your own life and the stories of those that are in front of you, though there are these significant societal and economic and differences, and yet, it's not hard to kind of come to a deep belief that we are actually family.
Yeah, I there are a lot of very interesting references to philosophers and people that interest me as well. And one of the references that you make a couple of times is to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit scientist, mystic, paleontologist, uh, and and his famous Mass on the World, which was something that he wrote about an experience when he was in the desert in Mongolia or China or something. And he said, "Here, I don't have an altar or I don't have the bread and wine to offer Mass, and so I'm offering the world as the altar, and uh, you're with and it was a way of his talking about how God, the incarnation, descends into matter and is in the world around us. And I had almost the feeling that you were doing that with the prison, that you were offering up the prison experience itself as the altar, and inviting God's presence and discovering God's presence in this kind of heart of darkness.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, even though I'm moved, Robert, that's what you read, because even if it wasn't conscious from the beginning, I
Mm.
think by the end, I felt that this book was in many ways kind of over time was inspired by Desjardins' meditations, Mass on
Mhm.
the World, and other letters and things that he had written, because it clarified for me what happened that Tuesday evening in October of 2013. The and I don't, I know we some have to be careful kind of describing kind of religious experience and mystical experience and kind of without trying to kind of label it, but for me it was an initiation into the reality of the presence of God in these spaces of incredible darkness. And how does that happen? How does one go into a space where there is so many injustices and so much cruelty and there discover um, the presence of God in a way that I hadn't discovered before? And I feel like ever since then, it's been me trying to kind of make sense of that and kind of work from that experience. And, whether it was in a way for me, I mean, it was, I think of it as my time in the prisons was, and especially in those early days and months and years as I'm still trying to figure out my vocation and discerning the priesthood, that it was an experience of a kind of ordination. And as I describe in the book, it's ordination to say, to holy orders and to the priesthood, but it was more so a kind of ordination, a discovery of this sacred life as brothers, all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And uh, that, to me, Desjardins uh, uh, helps me, I think, theologically think about the work of kenosis, of God's descent, and that God, it does appear through scripture, descends oftentimes into the lowest spaces,
Mm.
um, into those kind of forgotten places.
Mm.
And that begins the work of repair for Desjardins too. I think
Mm.
the incarnation is descending into those lowest kind of
Mm.
spaces,
Mm.
and from that begins this ascent in the work of repairing, of
Mm.
redeeming of the universe.
Yeah, you're not as explicit about this as I might have thought, but we know a lot of Christians think, oh, God descends into church or something like that, descends into these holy places. God is uncomfortable with anything that's dirty or messy or sinful or whatever. But the Gospels are completely different. Jesus immerses, consorts with people who are considered criminals, unclean, whose very touch is contaminating, people who are outsiders. And then he's crucified, as a criminal. And he says that the thief crucified next to him today, you will be with me in paradise. Not with the good religious people, but exactly into these darkest, kind of places. There was a passage where she said, "From here on out, among these trapped and forgotten, I would witness such an aliveness bestowed on humanity." And I began to see it continuously with its untold depths. Here on the G Wing, I felt I had discovered the heart of the world, a heart ablaze in steel, forgotten in confinement. Yeah, that was very Teilhardian
Mhm.
passage. Uh, well,
Yeah.
let's move into we've got the prison world, the death chamber world, and the relationships you establish there with particular people who are portrayed so indelibly that I'll never forget them. And then you just conceive of this idea of an alternative. And even though it involves just relatively, few people, you establish this kind of havens, Joseph House. Uh, what were your intentions there, and how did that work out?
So I think the intentions, from early on in my first months visiting not only death row but solitary confinement, over Florida is the largest of all the states in Florida in terms of the highest rate of people in solitary confinement. We have at any given minute, there are 10,000 men and some women, but mostly men in solitary confinement. And
Mm,
I think the closest next state is Texas at 4,000. So that
mm,
shows just how egregious our state is in placing people into places that, and I say this, I've heard other volunteers and prison, even staff say, right, these are places that most of us wouldn't even want our dog to stay in. So it's pretty grim. But it was there in those first couple of months that I would say myself and others that I was talking with in prison chaplaincy, we're conceiving of an idea of what would be a home that is like the counter to this. Like if the state is telling this story about who these men are and what their value is by putting them in these horrible places, how could we counter that with a very different kind of narrative of who these men are and what type of space would would showcase their dignity. And so for a couple of years there as a seminarian, and then after being ordained to the priesthood, I was, dreaming and dreaming and dreaming and talking with different people, both people on the inside, like what would you want out of a house or out of a program that you would re-enter back into society, and then talking with social workers. Dr. Mariah Morrison, who I mentioned frequently in the book at Equal Justice Initiative, helped me kind of dream and vision this house and this a community. And that was to me really, Robert, kind of first and foremost. I had one gentleman in prison tell me, he said, "I don't really know, Father, what to tell you about creating a reentry home, but I can tell you one thing. I never want to go into another program.
mm,
I've grown up in these programs. I'm done with programs."
mm,
And that stuck with me. And I think, we've at Joseph House in creating this house, I'm actually here now this is where I live at Joseph House. We've sought to create a home
mm,
with a community. I mean, not far from any kind of utopia, very much a lived in community of people that has programming, but first and foremost is a community welcoming these men back into society so that they have a space in a community that speaks to their dignity, to their value,
mm,
that a great sister sister of St. Joseph who used to minister here in Tallahassee, Sister Christine, she's since passed, would say oftentimes that the first sign of God's presence and justice is hospitality.
mm, mm,
And that to me is kind of what we've aspired to do at Joseph House, creating a welcoming space for these men coming oftentimes
mm.
straight out of these confinement dorms.
Yeah. Well, in some cases, these are people you knew during their incarceration, well, maybe all of them while they were incarcerated. So they have a kind of relationship with you.
Mhm.
But you're very honest and frank about the challenges and the illusion of thinking that this is all just going to be fine. There's going to be new problems, but these are people who've been locked up for decades, who have been just immersed in fear and surrounded by cynicism and distrust, and they test you sometimes, or they are, you know, trying to see if you're for real, and you make your own mistakes sometimes. You try to fix them. But that is, there are these just wonderful stories of individuals, and some of the road, the bumps in the road that you encounter, sometimes even feeling like it's all a big failure, and then suddenly there's some kind of ray of hope or love or goodness that shines through and keeps you going.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I, you know, right. We've heard Pope Francis say again and again that it's not about us evangelizing the poor or the marginalized, but it's about us being evangelized by them.
Mhm.
And the reason I mention that in this case is that my brothers here have kind of have taught me, and their needs have taught me, what type of community this should be. I kind of started in with ideas and grand plans, and we'll just celebrate, celebrate, celebrate,
Mhm.
uh, and then, about a couple of months into it, realize, wow, there's still a lot of fires kind of raging internally in these men. And no
Mhm.
matter how nice I make their room, or no matter how much good food we provide, that there are these incredible needs that are not only needing to be met, but needing to at least be even addressed. And oftentimes that requires people to sometimes tear things down in that
Mhm.
process. And that's so I think there was another kind of an awakening where it's one thing about trying to find ways for people to be set free from a brutal and unjust oppressive system. It's something entirely different about creating a healing community that really requires a life together. And I'll just say one thing here that one of my guiding kind of North Stars in this process has been Brian Stevenson, the
Yes.
attorney, founder of Equal Justice Initiative, wrote Just Mercy, and his emphasis again and again and again on proximity, and that proximity really is kind of an end, that it's about drawing close. And it doesn't work perfectly. It's not a solution to problems necessarily. But I think that in my now 7-year experience into this experiment with Joseph House, um, proximity is where healing takes
Mhm.
place. And not just for the men, right? But for those of us that are that are in this kind of safe and healthy society as well. And again, I think that goes back to the porous reality between us, is that
Mhm.
you realize that we're actually building this together,
Mhm. Mhm.
on myself and other community members here.
Well, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what do you think the kind of wider meaning or lessons of your story are and what you're sharing? Because on the one hand, it offers this very critique of the prison system as we know it, and also kind of offers like a window and what would be a very different way of approaching people that restores them to humanity and to the community, etc. But as I said, I didn't feel this is your particular path, but I didn't feel this was just about prison. I thought that this says so much about the meaning of life and for Christians the gospel, uh, and even just kind of cosmic kinds of thoughts about the underlying kind of goodness that you say is at the heart of reality or the universe even. Uh, I wouldn't want people just to read this as just a story about a prison and here's an alternative to rehabilitation or something. I felt it was really a deep spiritual journey that you take us on, and I wish a lot more people could join you on that journey. And what would you like them to know, learn from this?
That's a thank you, Robert, for that, because I think it's one. So there's a psychoanalyst, Uri Schaefer, um, who wrote this book called Bad Feelings. It's an incredible spiritual book. I don't know if he's religious, but he's a secular kind of psychoanalyst. But it was a powerful meditation on goodness
Hmm.
and on change. And and there's a kind of line that just has kind of haunted me in a good way over the period of time of my time in going into the prisons and then beginning Joseph House. And that is that essentially that, his one of his central thoughts is that we have so many defense mechanisms as human beings based on his clinical experience that guard us from the experience of goodness. And that seems counterintuitive, like we would all want to experience goodness. But he's speaking of a kind of a goodness that 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 changes us and that helps us to develop into fuller human lives. And in some ways, this book as a kind of as a memoir for me and my experience, and even after, having written it, I kind of go back and think about it as my experience of undergoing of a change. And that I think that, that this is a somewhat kind of a universal possibility that perhaps many of us at times set up all sorts of buffers in trying to kind of maintain the status quo of life, and we seek a kind of a life that's unchanging, that can capture kind of what we want, and perhaps not be too exposed to um, the wider universe. But I think faith is about risk based
Mm.
upon my readings in scripture. And oftentimes it's a calling out of the tent, like Abraham, to look at a much wider universe and a journey that, yes, is going to be filled with darkness, but also light. And for me, I think this story is not only about these men who are also changing oftentimes and
Mm.
seeking change. But it's also for those of us, certainly myself, who what happens when we kind of get into close proximity and the type of turbulence that happens. There's all sorts of reasons why, I might be justified in fleeing, right, or giving
Mhm.
up and
Mhm.
pursuing a much more kind of calm life on a parish on the coast and the
Mhm.
panhandle. But I can't help, Robert, just my own thinking and the people that have inspired me that there's great truth to the world that we live in um, when we draw close to not only the people, those that are marginalized, but when we draw close to reality and the lived experience of others. And I think we all have, and I certainly had those defense mechanisms resisting it. But the closer that I've come to these, again, these kind of dark spaces, the strangeness, the paradox is that I've come now to have a, a deeper faith in the reality of goodness in this
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
and the goodness that we share with each other.
That's beautiful. That's really a lot. That's what I kind of took away from this, and the hope that people reading this fantastic book will uh, think about the possibility of stepping outside of their protective comfort zone, taking the risk of close proximity to other people, even people different from them, and the possibility of surprising grace and goodness that may come from that growth. I'm afraid we're just running out of time here. So let me again urge everyone to read this fantastic book. Uh, halfway, excuse me, more than halfway home. And the book ends on the last note saying that this is the Joseph House is not a halfway house; it's a home. Uh, so thank you for sharing your home with us, and it's been really wonderful talking with you.
Oh, thanks so much, Robert, for the invitation. Appreciated it.
Farewell. All the best.